At my only son's wedding, his new mother-in-law handed me a serving tray and told me, loud enough for 200 people to hear, "Honey, the catering staff uses the back entrance. This is a private family celebration." 200 people heard her. Not one of them corrected her, including my son. I was standing in the main hallway of the Pemberton estate on Isle of Palms, holding a wedding gift wrapped in gold paper, a Bible that had belonged to my late husband's grandmother, with a handwritten letter tucked inside for my son and his new wife. I was wearing a navy blue dress I had sewn myself 3 weeks before. My hair was pinned up the way my mother taught me when I was 8 years old. I had on the single strand of pearls my husband gave me on our 25th anniversary, 3 months before he died. I was 60 years old. I was the mother of the groom. And Eleanor Pemberton looked me in the face and handed me a silver tray like I was hired help. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not even set the gift down angrily. I took that silver tray in my left hand. I placed the gift box on the side table next to me, and I placed the tray carefully on top of the box. Then I looked Eleanor Pemberton in the eye and I said very softly, "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Pemberton." And I walked out the front door. My son saw the whole thing. His name is Darius Whitfield. He was 32 years old that day. He was standing maybe 15 feet away, in a tuxedo I had helped him pick out, next to a bride whose family I had only met twice. He saw his mother being humiliated by his new mother-in-law in front of every important person in Charleston society. He looked at me. Then he looked at his wife. Then he looked away. That was the moment my heart broke in a way it had never broken before. Not when my husband died. Not when my own mother passed. Something different. Something colder. Because grief you can survive. Grief is clean. But watching your only child choose silence over you in a room full of strangers, that is a wound that changes what kind of woman you become. I drove myself home to Savannah that night. 2 hours on Interstate 95, alone with the radio off. I did not call my sister. I did not call my pastor. I did not stop for gas or coffee. I just drove. And somewhere around the Georgia state line, I stopped being the Anna Mae Whitfield that everybody thought they knew. That was the last Sunday I ever pretended to be small. That was the last time I said nothing. Before I tell you what I did next, you need to know who I was. My name is Anna Mae Whitfield. I was born Anna Mae Carter in Beaufort, South Carolina, in the summer of 1965. My mother, Loretta Carter, cleaned houses for white families on the coast. My father, Samuel Carter, worked the docks until his back gave out when I was 14. We were not poor the way television shows poor people. We were working poor, which means we had clean clothes and food on the table and a roof that didn't leak, and we never ever complained to anyone about anything. My mother used to say, "Anna, the world is going to underestimate you every day of your life. Let it. That is your advantage." I did not understand what she meant until I was 55 years old, sitting across the table from Eleanor Pemberton for the first time. I met my husband, James Whitfield, at Morehouse College's sister event with Spelman in the spring of 1984. He was studying to be a minister. I was studying business and accounting. He told me, on our second date, that he was going to marry me, and that we were going to raise children who understood both scripture and compound interest. I laughed at him. He was serious. We got married in June of 1986 in a small church in Savannah, Georgia, with 28 people in attendance and a reception that cost $460. My mother made the cake. James's mother made the potato salad. We honeymooned for 3 days in a cabin near the Okefenokee Swamp, and we came home happier than any couple has a right to be. James became the Reverend James Whitfield of Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church in Savannah in 1992. I worked during those years as a junior accountant at a small investment firm in Atlanta called Meridian Capital Partners. I commuted on weekends. I was the only black woman in the office for the first 11 years I worked there. I was the only woman, period, for the first 4. Here is what nobody in Charleston knew. By 1998, I had been promoted to senior financial analyst. By 2003, I was the director of commercial real estate investments. By the time I took early retirement in 2019, I had personally managed a portfolio of commercial properties worth over $180 million for Meridian's clients. And while I was doing that work, I was also quietly building my own. In 1994, James and I made a decision together that shaped the rest of my life. We decided that every bonus I received, every commission, Every performance payout would be invested, not spent. We decided we would live on James's ministry salary and my base pay, and not a dollar more. We decided that no one, not our closest friends, not our pastor, not our own son, would ever know the full picture of what we were building. James called it quiet money. He said, "Anna, loud money attracts loud problems. Quiet money gives you quiet power, and quiet power is the only kind that lasts." By the time James died of a stroke in February of 2012, we had accumulated a little over $1.2 million in real estate investments, mostly small commercial properties in growing southern cities: Charlotte, Atlanta, Nashville, Charleston, Savannah. I was 47 years old and a widow, and I had a 14-year-old son to finish raising. I did not change how I lived. I did not buy a new house. I did not trade in my Buick. I kept going to church every Sunday at Greater Mount Zion, where James's name was still on the plaque by the sanctuary door. I kept making gumbo for the women's auxiliary potlucks. I kept pinning my hair up and wearing the same 3 good dresses in rotation. And I kept investing. Over the next 13 years, through careful management and a few very good opportunities in the post-2008 market, that $1.2 million became $4.7 million. The portfolio was held under a limited liability company I had named Magnolia Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware, managed out of a small office in Atlanta that nobody in my regular life ever visited. My only child, Darius James Whitfield, grew up not knowing any of this. He grew up knowing that his mama worked hard and came home tired. He grew up knowing that we ate rice and beans 3 nights a week. He grew up knowing that vacation meant driving to Myrtle Beach and staying in a 2-bedroom rental, and that Christmas meant one nice present and a lot of homemade ones. He grew up believing we were a modest middle-class family in a modest middle-class neighborhood, and that any success he wanted in life, he was going to have to earn himself. That was not a lie. That was the lesson. James and I agreed that our son needed to build his own character before he ever saw his inheritance. We agreed that money given too early ruins good children. We agreed that Darius needed to know the value of work before he ever knew the value of wealth. Darius did not disappoint us. He graduated from Windsor Forest High School at the top of his class. He went to Morehouse on partial scholarship, and I paid the rest quietly. He graduated with honors and went on to Yale School of Architecture, where he earned his master's degree in 2017. He worked for 2 years in Atlanta, then accepted a position at a prestigious architecture firm in Charleston, South Carolina, in 2019. That is where he met Brooke Pemberton. Brooke was 26 years old at the time, a junior associate at the same firm, on what I came to understand was a very slow partner track. Her family had been in Charleston since 1768. Her great-great-great-grandfather had owned 3 rice plantations along the Ashley River. Her father, Walter Pemberton III, owned 4 boutique hotels along the South Carolina coast and a commercial real estate company called Pemberton Properties. Her mother, Eleanor, was the president of the Charleston Heritage Society and sat on the boards of 3 museums and a conservatory. Her younger brother, Spencer, was 28 and, according to the family, managed operations for Pemberton Hospitality Group. I met Brooke for the first time in the spring of 2024, when Darius brought her home for a weekend visit to Savannah. She was polite in the way that wealthy Southern women are polite, all smiles and yes ma'am, and compliments about my garden. But her eyes never stopped evaluating. She evaluated my kitchen. She evaluated my wallpaper. She evaluated the framed photographs on my mantel. She evaluated me. I made her shrimp and grits for dinner. She ate 2 bites. After dinner, while Darius was in the living room watching the game with my brother-in-law, Brooke sat with me in the kitchen and asked me, in the sweetest voice you ever heard, "Mrs. Whitfield, what did you do for work before you retired?" I said I was a secretary at an investment firm in Atlanta for many years. It was not exactly a lie. It was what I always said to people. James used to call it protective truth. It kept people's expectations where I wanted them. Brooke smiled and said, "That must have been so fulfilling. My mama always says the real foundation of any good company is the women who keep it organized." I smiled back. I said, "Your mama sounds wise." What I did not say was, I owned 3 buildings in Atlanta at that time, and one of them was the office tower her family's real estate company was currently renting space in. What I did not say was, I had spent 30 years in rooms full of men like her father, and I had learned every one of their tells. What I did not say was, I could have bought her family's entire business with cash that night and still had 7 figures left over to do it again. I said none of those things. I smiled. I poured her more sweet tea. I let her evaluate me, because that is what my mama taught me. Let them underestimate you. It is your advantage. 6 months later, Darius called me on a Sunday evening and told me he had proposed. He said Brooke had cried. He said her parents wanted to host an engagement dinner at their estate in Charleston. He said, "Mama, I know they're different from us, but they're good people, and I really love her." I told him I was happy for him. I told him love is worth more than money. I told him I would be proud to meet her family. I meant all of those things. I also started paying closer attention. The engagement dinner was held at the Pemberton Estate on Isle of Palms in October of 2024. It was the first time I had ever set foot inside their home. It was the first time I met Eleanor, Walter, and Spencer Pemberton. Walter was a tall, gray-haired man in his early 60s, with the permanently pink face of a heavy drinker and the loose handshake of a man who has never been told no. Eleanor was 58, thin, blonde, and wore pearls the size of grapes around her neck. Spencer was 28, handsome, sullen, and smelled faintly of bourbon before the first course was served. They greeted me at the door. Eleanor took my hands in both of hers and said, "Oh, Anna, finally. We have been just dying to meet Darius's mother." Walter kissed me on the cheek without actually touching my skin. Spencer looked at me, nodded once, and walked to the bar. Dinner was served by 3 women in uniforms. I was seated at the far end of the 12-person table, next to an elderly cousin of Walter's who talked only to the man on his other side. Across from me was an empty chair. Eleanor asked me, over the salad course, "Anna, what part of Savannah are you from?" I told her. She said, "Oh, how charming. We have the most darling little chapel we visit when we're in Savannah for the regatta. St. Michael's. Do you know it?" I did not. I attended Greater Mount Zion Baptist. I did not mention this. She asked me, over the entree, "And what did you do for work, dear?" I told her what I told everyone. Secretary, investment firm, Atlanta. She nodded sympathetically and said, "How wonderful that you were able to provide for Darius. Single motherhood is just so admirable." I was not a single mother. I had been married to James for 26 years. James had died when Darius was 14. I had raised him alone as a widow for the remaining 4 years before he left for college. That is not the same as single motherhood, and Eleanor Pemberton, with her perfect memory for names and dates and family lineages, absolutely knew the difference. She was testing me. I smiled. I said, "James and I were very blessed, yes. He was a wonderful father before the Lord called him home." She said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize." She realized. She realized exactly. Over dessert, Walter began telling a long story about the history of the Pemberton family in South Carolina. He told us about the original land grant in 1768. He told us about the 3 rice plantations along the Ashley. He told us, and I am quoting him directly, "Of course, those were different times, and every Southern family has chapters it doesn't brag about, but you have to understand the foundation of legacy. Legacy is what separates the serious families from the temporary ones." He raised his glass to Darius. "To Darius," he said, "the first man in this family in 4 generations to marry into us from outside the Low Country. We welcome you, son, and we promise you, you are joining something built to last." Everyone at the table raised their glass. Everyone smiled. Darius smiled a little stiffly and looked at me. I smiled back at him and raised my water glass with everyone else. I did not drink. On the drive home to Savannah that night, Darius called me from his car. He said, "Mama, what did you think?" I said, "I think Brooke is a lovely young woman." He said, "What did you think of her family?" I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Baby, I love you. You know that. I will support whatever choice you make." He said, "Mama, come on, tell me." I said, "Darius, her family is not our family. They are from a different world. That is not a bad thing. But you are going to have to be very careful not to lose yourself inside of it." He got quiet. Then he said, "Mama, I'm not going to lose myself. I'm going to build something. We're going to build something together. They're going to help us. They already said they'd help us get started." I said, "Baby, people who offer help before you ask for it are usually buying something. Make sure you know what they're buying." He laughed a little. He said, "Mama, you are always so suspicious." I said, "I am always right." He said, "I love you." I said, "I love you too." That was 3 weeks before the wedding. The night before the wedding, I drove up to Charleston and checked into a small hotel on King Street. Darius was staying at the estate with the bridal party. I had dinner alone at a little seafood place near the water, and I walked back to the hotel slowly, looking at the houses, thinking about James, thinking about the life we had built together, and the son we had raised, and the woman my son had chosen, and her family, and what all of it meant. In my hotel room that night, I sat on the edge of the bed and did something I had not done in a long time. I opened the Bible I had brought as a wedding gift, the one that had belonged to James's grandmother. I opened it to the front where there was a handwritten family tree going back 4 generations. I looked at the names. I looked at the dates. I traced my finger down the branches. Then I wrote a letter, on a piece of good stationery, in my best handwriting. It was addressed to my son and his bride. It said in part, "I am giving you this Bible because it belonged to your great-great-grandmother, Willa Mae Whitfield, who was born a slave on a rice plantation in South Carolina in 1858. She taught herself to read from this book. She kept it her entire life. She passed it to her son, who passed it to her grandson, who passed it to your grandfather, who passed it to your father, who passed it to me. Tonight, I am passing it to you. What I want you to know, Darius and Brooke, is that every name in this book built the hands you were given. Honor them. Honor each other. Honor the people who came before you, and honor the people who raised you, because without any of them, neither of you would be standing here tomorrow." I signed it. "With all my love, Mama." I sealed the letter in the front of the Bible, and I wrapped the whole thing in gold paper with a white ribbon. That was the gift that was in my hands the next afternoon when Eleanor Pemberton handed me a silver tray and told me the catering staff used the back entrance. That was the gift that sat on the side table, underneath that silver tray, for the rest of the wedding reception. I do not know to this day whether Darius ever went back and found it. The morning of my son's wedding, I woke up at 5:30 in my hotel room on King Street. I had not slept well. I do not sleep well in strange beds, and I had not slept well in my own bed for about 3 weeks, if I'm being honest. Something had been sitting in my chest since the engagement dinner, a feeling I could not quite name. The feeling you get when you walk into a room and you know before anyone says a word that something is not right. I ordered coffee from room service. I sat by the window and watched the sun come up over the Charleston rooftops. I read my Bible. I prayed for my son. I prayed for his bride. I prayed most of all for myself, that I would be gracious, that I would be patient, that I would be the kind of mother-in-law my own mother had been to James. Quiet, steady, present without being pushy. Around 7 I called Darius. He did not pick up. I called again at 8. He did not pick up. At 9 he texted me, "Mama, sorry, crazy morning. Brooke's mom has everything scheduled. I'll see you at the ceremony. Love you." That was the last thing my son said to me before my life changed. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon on the lawn of the Pemberton estate at Isle of Palms. It is a property I want you to picture clearly. A white antebellum mansion with 6 columns across the front, 2-story porches wrapping around both sides, live oaks draped with Spanish moss lining the drive. It is the kind of house that shows up on postcards and in magazines about the charm of the Old South. It is the kind of house where you cannot walk through a single room without being reminded that somebody's great-great-great-grandfather built his fortune on the backs of people who looked like me. I pulled up to the estate at 3:15 in my Buick LeSabre. There were valet attendants at the front circle, taking keys from Mercedes and Range Rovers and a vintage Rolls-Royce. I rolled down my window and told the young man, a black kid about 20 years old, that I was Darius Whitfield's mother. He smiled warmly. He said, "Yes, ma'am. Right this way?" He parked my car himself. He walked me up to the front entrance. At the front door, there was a woman in a headset holding a clipboard. She was white, maybe 40, with the tight smile of someone who had been planning this wedding for 8 months and was running on 3 hours of sleep. She looked at me. She looked at her clipboard. She looked at me again. She said, "Ma'am, are you with the catering team? Staff check-in is around back, through the service entrance." I said, "I am the mother of the groom." She froze. For 1 full second. Her face did a little flinch. Then she recovered and said, Oh, Mrs. Whitfield, of course I am so sorry. Please come right in." She did not check my name off her clipboard. She just waved me through. That was the first one. I walked into the front hall of the Pemberton estate in my navy blue dress, with my pearls, with my hair pinned up the way my mother taught me, carrying the gold-wrapped Bible in both hands. The hall was full of people in formal wear, holding champagne flutes, talking in the low, polished voices that wealthy Southern people use when they want you to know they have nothing to prove. Nobody looked at me. That is not entirely true. A few people looked at me and then looked away quickly, the way you look at someone when you have decided in an instant that they are not someone you need to engage with. Two women in silk dresses actually turned their shoulders away from me as I passed. I found the seating chart on a gold-framed easel near the entrance to the lawn. My name was on it. Anna Whitfield, Table 18. Table 18 was described on the chart as being on the family side of the reception tent. I walked out to the lawn. The ceremony space was beautiful. There is no point in pretending otherwise. White chairs in perfect rows, a wooden arch covered in magnolia blossoms, a string quartet playing softly, the ocean just visible over the dunes behind the arch. It was the kind of wedding that costs $300,000 and looks like it costs $3 million. The first two rows on both sides were marked reserved family. I sat down in the second row on the groom's side, on the aisle. About 10 minutes later, a young woman with a headset came over to me. She said very sweetly, "Ma'am, these rows are reserved for immediate family. We have seating for other guests starting in row 4. I said, "I am the mother of the groom." She froze. Her eyes went to her iPad. She scrolled. She said, Oh, I am so sorry, I didn't. Of course, yes, please, I apologize." I stayed in my seat. That was the second one. Darius's side of the family filled in around me slowly. My sister Vernita and her husband Clarence drove up from Savannah and sat next to me. My cousin Dorothy flew in from Atlanta. Darius's uncle on James's side, Reverend Theodore Whitfield, sat in the front row with his wife Lillian. All told, there were 11 people on the groom's side of the family. On the bride's side, there were over 100. The ceremony itself was lovely. I will give Eleanor that. She had excellent taste in flowers. The minister was a white Episcopal priest who had apparently known Brooke since she was baptized. He spoke warmly about the Pemberton family's long history in the Low Country. He spoke about the joining of two families, two traditions, two great lineages. He did not at any point mention my son's family by name. Darius looked handsome. He looked nervous. He did not look at me once during the entire ceremony. Brooke came down the aisle on her father's arm in a dress that probably cost more than my first car. She was beautiful. She was beaming. She looked straight ahead at Darius the entire walk, and when she reached the altar, she handed her bouquet to her maid of honor and took both of Darius's hands, and they smiled at each other in a way that made my heart hurt because I realized right in that moment that my son really did love her. He loved her. And that is what made everything that came later so much harder. The reception was held inside a massive white tent on the back lawn, overlooking the water. 300 guests. 12-piece jazz band, raw bar with oysters flown in from Maine, a carving station with beef tenderloin, 4 open bars. The whole thing. My table, Table 18, was at the very back of the tent, closest to the service entrance. I was seated with my sister, her husband, and 5 other guests I did not recognize. 3 older couples who turned out to be Walter's former college fraternity brothers and their wives, and a single elderly woman who was, as far as I could tell, deaf. The head table, where Darius and Brooke sat, was at the front, raised on a small platform. Eleanor and Walter flanked the couple. On Eleanor's other side were Brooke's grandparents. On Walter's other side were Spencer and his girlfriend. There was no seat at the head table for me. My sister Vernita noticed before I did. She leaned over during the salad course and whispered, "Anna, you are supposed to be sitting up there. That is where the mother of the groom sits." I said, "It is fine, Vernita." She said, "It is not fine." I said, "Let it be." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she nodded slowly, and she said, "All right, Anna. All right. Vernita knows me. Vernita knows when I have gone quiet. I have not gone weak. I have gone to work." The toast started during the entree course. Walter stood up first. He is the kind of man who loves a microphone. He thanked the guests. He thanked the venue. He thanked the caterer by name. He thanked the wedding planner by name. He did not thank me. Then he started on what he called a few words about this wonderful union. He told a story about meeting Darius for the first time at the engagement dinner. He said, "I will be honest with you all. When my daughter told me she was bringing home an architect she worked with from Georgia, I had some questions. Light laughter from the crowd. I had some questions about background. I had some questions about prospects. I had some questions about, let's just say, the direction this was all heading. More laughter, louder. But then I met Darius, and I thought, well, all right, this young man has manners. This young man has ambition. This young man is going to work very hard to be worthy of what he's marrying into. The laughter was now uncomfortable. A few people shifted in their chairs. And I told my wife, I said, Eleanor, every great Southern family needs a little fresh blood now and then. A little, how shall I say it? A little diversity to keep things interesting. The laughter had stopped. Walter raised his glass. To Darius, welcome to the Pembertons. We are going to teach you so much. Nobody knew what to do. A few people raised their glasses. Most did not. Darius's face was a careful, frozen mask. Brooke was beaming, clapping, completely oblivious. I looked at my son. He did not look at me. That was the third one. Spencer Pemberton gave the next toast. He was already drunk. I had watched him drink 4 bourbons during the cocktail hour alone. He stood up, swaying slightly, and said something about being excited to have a brother from the hood, and then he laughed like it was the funniest thing he had ever said. A few of his fraternity brother cousins laughed with him. Most of the room stared at their plates. Darius stared at his plate. Brooke laughed. She actually laughed. Spencer said, I'm kidding, I'm kidding. Darius, you know I love you, man. Welcome to the family. He raised his glass. He sat down. He ordered another bourbon. I put down my fork. I had not eaten a bite of my entree. I stood up from my seat at table 18 and I walked toward the main hallway of the house to use the restroom and to get myself composed. I was in the hallway, the long, wood-paneled main hallway of the Pemberton estate, with the family portraits going back 7 generations on both walls, when Eleanor Pemberton intercepted me. She was holding a silver serving tray. She had taken it from a server who was passing by. She had walked over to me with intention. The hallway was full of people. Guests moving between the tent and the house to use the restrooms, to get fresh air, to escape the heat. At least 20 people in the immediate vicinity, maybe more. Eleanor stopped in front of me. She smiled the warmest, most poisonous smile I have ever seen on a human being. And she said, loud enough for everyone in that hallway to hear, Oh, honey, bless your heart. You don't need to clean up. The catering staff handles all of that. And next time, sweetheart, please use the back entrance, through the kitchen. It's just more appropriate. This is a private family celebration, and we don't want any confusion for our guests. And she pressed that silver tray into my hands. The hallway went silent. I want you to understand what silence sounds like in a room full of people. It is not the absence of noise. It is the sound of 20-something adults all deciding at the same time that they are not going to say a single word. It is the sound of champagne glasses being held very still. It is the sound of a string quartet playing in another room, while in this room, nobody breathes. I saw Darius. He was standing about 15 feet away, at the entrance to the tent, with Brooke on his arm. They had been walking toward the hallway, probably toward us, probably toward me. They had stopped. Brooke put her hand over her mouth, and her shoulders shook, and I realized she was laughing. Trying not to, but laughing. Darius looked at me. He looked at his mother, 60 years old, standing in the hallway of his new in-law's mansion, holding a silver serving tray that his new mother-in-law had just shoved into her hands in front of 20 witnesses. And he looked away. He turned his face, and he looked out at the lawn, and he did not say one word. I stood there for 3 seconds. I counted them. 1, 2, 3. Then I did what I did. I took the silver tray in my left hand. I walked 5 steps to the side table against the wall, where I had set down the gold-wrapped Bible when I first came in, the wedding gift for my son and his new wife. I placed the tray carefully on top of the gift. I straightened it so it sat neatly on the package. I turned back to Eleanor. I said, "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Pemberton." My voice was calm. My voice was steady. My voice was the voice of a woman who has decided something, inside herself, that nobody else in the room understands yet. Eleanor's smile faltered just a little. She had expected tears. She had expected embarrassment. She had expected me to make a scene. She had not expected me to thank her. I walked past her. I walked down the hallway, through the front parlor, through the foyer, and out the front door. I did not rush. I did not look back. I walked out the way I had walked in. The valet brought my car around. The same young man, the black kid. He could tell something was wrong. He did not ask. He just opened my door for me, and he said very softly, "You drive safe, ma'am." I said, "Thank you, baby." As I was getting into the car, a woman came hurrying out of the house behind me. A black woman in a catering uniform, maybe 55 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a bun. She ran up to my window. She said, ma'am, please. I need you to know, we saw that. All of us in the kitchen saw that. And ma'am, that is not right. That is not how you treat somebody. I am so sorry. I am just so sorry." I looked at her. I took her hand through the window. I squeezed it. I said, "What is your name, sister?" She said, Loretta Johnson." I said, "Miss Loretta, it is not your fault and you do not need to apologize. But thank you. Thank you for seeing me." She had tears in her eyes. I said, "Miss Loretta, I need you to do me one small favor. There is a gold-wrapped package on the side table in the main hallway, underneath a silver tray. When nobody is looking, could you go back in there and set that package on the head table in front of my son's plate? Do not say anything to anyone about it. Just put it there." She nodded fiercely. She said, Yes, ma'am, I will do that right now." I said, "Thank you, Miss Loretta." I drove away. It is 118 miles from Isle of Palms to my house in Savannah. I drove every one of them with the radio off and the windows up and both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, the way my daddy taught me. I did not cry. I want you to understand something about that. I have heard people say, all my life, that black women do not cry because we were taught not to. That is not exactly true. I cried when James died. I cried at my mama's funeral. I cried when Darius got accepted to Yale, and I realized my husband would not get to see him walk across the stage. I know how to cry. I did not cry on that drive because I was not sad. I was clear. There is a difference between grief and clarity. Grief is a fog. Clarity is a knife. On that drive home, I was not in a fog. I was sharpening. I thought about Eleanor Pemberton, the serving tray, the smile, the words, "Bless your heart, honey," the catering staff, the back entrance, just more appropriate. I replayed those words at 65 miles an hour down Interstate 95, and with every mile, I heard them more clearly. I thought about Walter Pemberton. A little diversity, to keep things interesting. The laughter of his fraternity brothers. The way he had raised his glass to my son as if he were doing him a favor by allowing him to marry his daughter. I thought about Spencer Pemberton, a brother from the hood, drunk at his own sister's wedding, laughing at his own joke while the rest of the room stared at their plates. I thought about Brooke, the way her shoulders shook, the hand over her mouth, the laugh she could not quite suppress. And I thought about my son. I thought about my son the longest. I thought about him from Ravenel to Ridgeland for 45 minutes of pure highway, with nothing around me but pine trees and road signs and my own face in the rearview mirror. Darius had seen it. Darius had watched his mother be humiliated by his mother-in-law, in public, at his own wedding, and he had chosen, in that 1 second, in that hallway, with the whole room watching, to look away. I want to be clear about what I was feeling. I was not angry at him, not exactly. Anger is a hot feeling. What I felt on that drive was cold and specific. I understood my son better by the time I crossed into Georgia than I had understood him in 32 years of raising him. My son had made a calculation. He had looked at his mother on one side and his new wife and her family on the other side, and he had calculated that his future was on the Pemberton side. He had calculated that saying something, defending me, making a scene, would cost him something he was not prepared to lose. He had calculated that I would forgive him, because I always forgave him, because I was his mama and mamas forgive. He had calculated correctly in one sense. I would forgive him, eventually, but he had calculated wrong in another sense. He had assumed that his mother was someone who had nothing to offer compared to what the Pembertons could offer. He had assumed that the math of his future came out in favor of the people who humiliated his mother, rather than in favor of the mother who had raised him. He had assumed that because he had always assumed that, because I had let him assume that, because I had spent 32 years hiding who I actually was, in order to make sure my son grew up with character before he grew up with wealth. And on that drive home, I realized something that changed everything. James had been right about raising Darius without showing him the money. James had been right that a child needs to build his own foundation before he sees his inheritance. James had been right about almost everything, but James had died when Darius was 14. James had not been there for the years after. James had not been there to watch our son slowly, carefully, shape himself into someone who would choose silence over his own mother in a room full of strangers. That was on me. That part was on me. I had protected my son from the knowledge of his family's wealth, and in protecting him, I had failed to protect him from becoming the kind of man who did not think his family was worth defending without it. That realization hit me just outside Savannah. Around 10 o'clock at night, I pulled off the highway at a rest stop. I parked the car, I sat with my hands on the wheel, and I let myself feel it for 1 minute, 60 seconds. I timed it on the dashboard clock. Then I started the car, and I drove the rest of the way home. I got home a little before 11. I did not turn on the porch light. I unlocked the front door, set my purse down on the entry table, took off my shoes, and walked through the dark house to the kitchen. I did not turn on the overhead light. I turned on the small lamp over the sink. I made myself a cup of coffee. Not tea, coffee. Black, strong, 2 scoops. I took the coffee into the living room. I sat down in James's old leather recliner. I did not turn on the television. I did not turn on any other lights. I sat in the dark, in my dead husband's chair, in my own house, in my wedding dress, and I drank my coffee. I did not call Vernita. She would be calling me soon, but I did not pick up when she did. I did not call Pastor Johnson at Greater Mount Zion. He would be hearing about this from Vernita, and he would be calling me too, but I did not pick up when he did either. I did not call anyone. I sat in the chair for a long time, maybe 2 hours. I finished the coffee. I watched the shadows from the streetlight move slowly across the living room wall as the clouds passed over the moon. And I thought about James. I thought about what he would have said if he had been alive. If he had been in that hallway this afternoon, I thought about how James would have picked up that silver tray and set it down carefully and walked over to Eleanor Pemberton and said something so quiet and so precise that she would have felt it in her chest for the rest of her natural life. James would have protected me, but James was not here. James had been gone for 14 years, and my son, the boy James and I had raised together, the boy James had prayed over every single night of his first 14 years, my son had not protected me. My son had looked away. Around 2 in the morning, I got up out of James's chair. I went upstairs to the bedroom. I changed out of my navy dress. I put on my robe. I went back downstairs. I went into the small office off the kitchen, the room James used to use as his study, the room where I kept my books and my files and the things that were mine alone. I unlocked the filing cabinet in the corner. I pulled out a thick leather-bound portfolio, my quiet money book, the ledger James and I had started together in 1994 and that I had maintained by hand every single month for 30 years. I sat down at the desk. I opened the book. I turned to the current page. I looked at the number at the bottom. Total Holdings, Magnolia Holdings, LLC, as of September 1st, 2024, $4,742,318. I turned the page. I picked up my pen. I started a new section. I wrote at the top of the page in my clearest handwriting, September 14th, 2024, Project Magnolia. And below that, I wrote a list of names. Eleanor Pemberton, Walter Pemberton, Spencer Pemberton. I looked at the list. I added one more line at the bottom. I wrote, Darius J. Whitfield. Then I capped my pen. I closed the book. I looked at the window, at the first pale gray of morning just starting to come up over the eastern sky, over the roofline of my neighbor's house. I said out loud to my empty kitchen, to my dead husband, to my own reflection in the dark window, all right then. I put the leather book back in the cabinet. I locked it. I went upstairs. I got into bed. I slept, for the first time in 3 weeks, for 8 straight hours. When I woke up, I was a different woman. The morning after the wedding, I woke up at 7, made myself breakfast. 2 eggs, toast, grits, coffee, and sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. I did not rush. I want you to understand that. I have watched too many movies and read too many books where a woman gets wronged and she flies into action that same afternoon, making phone calls, buying plane tickets, screaming at her lawyer. That is not how real work gets done. Real work gets done slowly. Real work gets done with patience and with research, and with the understanding that the best revenge is not the one you take, it is the one you build. I wrote 3 headings on my yellow legal pad. What I know, what I need to find out, what I am going to do. Under the first heading, I wrote down everything I already knew about the Pemberton family's business situation. I knew Walter owned 4 boutique hotels, all along the South Carolina coast. I knew one of them, the Pemberton Magnolia Inn, was the flagship, a fully restored antebellum property on King Street in Charleston that hosted events for the Charleston Heritage Society every fall. I knew Pemberton Properties, Walter's commercial real estate company, had been struggling for at least 5 years, because I had quietly watched it lose 2 of its biggest tenants to a competitor in 2021 and had not recovered either. I knew Walter's primary banker was Charleston Coastal Bank because my accountant had mentioned it years ago in passing when he was reviewing one of my own property holdings that happened to share a zoning board with a Pemberton development. Under the second heading, I wrote down what I did not yet know. Current debt levels, current cash position, who held the mortgages, what the family trust structure looked like, who Spencer actually reported to, and what he actually did, who Walter's loyal lieutenants were, and who was quietly unhappy, and most importantly, what the state of the Pemberton Magnolia Inn was financially. Under the third heading, I wrote only one line: call Gloria. Gloria Ferguson had been my attorney for 19 years. She was 62 years old, a Spelman graduate, a former prosecutor in Fulton County who had gone into private practice in Atlanta after her husband got sick. She was the best legal mind I had ever worked with. She was also one of the only people in my life outside of James and my sister who knew the full picture of what Magnolia Holdings actually was. I called her at 9 o'clock that Monday morning. I said, "Gloria, I need you to clear your calendar for me this week." She said, "Anna, what happened?" I told her. Not the whole long story, just the facts. The wedding, the tray, the words, the hallway, my son. I told it in maybe 4 minutes. She was silent for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "Anna Mae Whitfield, you tell me what you want to do, and I will tell you how we are going to do it legally, completely, and permanently." I said, "Gloria, I want a full workup on Pemberton Hospitality Group, Pemberton Properties, and the personal financial situation of Walter and Eleanor Pemberton. I want it in 30 days, spare no expense." She said, "Done." I said, "And Gloria, I also want you to look into their son, Spencer, quietly." She said, "Done." I said, "One more thing. I want to know everything there is to know about the Pemberton Magnolia Inn. Occupancy, revenue, mortgage, operating agreements, tax assessments, everything. I especially want to know if it is for sale. And if it is not for sale, I want to know what it would take to make it for sale." She said, "Anna, are you doing what I think you are doing?" I said, "Gloria, I am doing exactly what you think I am doing, and I am going to do it the right way." She laughed, one short, dry laugh. She said, "Honey, I have been waiting 20 years for somebody to deserve what you are about to deliver. I am in. Let me get to work." I hung up the phone. I refilled my coffee. I went back to my legal pad. I underlined the word patience 3 times at the top of the page. Then I started making the rest of my phone calls. The first was to James Okonkwo. Jimmy and my husband had been roommates at Morehouse in 1983. Jimmy had gone on to build one of the largest privately held hospitality investment funds in the Southeast, headquartered in Atlanta. Okonkwo Capital owned pieces of over 40 hotels across the southern United States. Jimmy was 64 years old, married to his college sweetheart, the father of 3 grown children. He had spoken at James's funeral. I had not called him in 6 years. I had sent a Christmas card every year, and he had sent one back, but we had not spoken on the phone since 2018. He picked up on the second ring. He said, "Anna Mae Whitfield, Lord have mercy. Is somebody dead?" I said, "Jimmy, nobody is dead, but I have a business proposition for you, and I need you to take me seriously." He said, "Anna, I have always taken you seriously. That is the whole reason James married you. Talk to me." I told him in 5 minutes what I wanted to do. I told him about the wedding, briefly, just the shape of it. I told him about Walter Pemberton's hotels. I told him about my Magnolia Holdings portfolio. I told him that I wanted to move quietly, through his fund as a partner, to acquire the Pemberton properties if and when they came on the market, which I suspected, based on what I already knew, would be very soon. Jimmy was quiet for about 10 seconds after I finished. Then he said, Anna, I have one question. Is this personal or is this business? I said, Jimmy, it is both, but the business has to stand on its own. I am not asking you to do anything that is not profitable for your fund. I am asking you to do something that happens to also be profitable for my soul. He laughed. He said, Anna, send me the numbers. If the deal makes sense for Okonkwo Capital on its own merits, we will do it. And if it does not, we will still find a way to help you. James Whitfield was my best friend in this world. You send me the numbers. I said, thank you, Jimmy. He said, Anna, one more thing. I said, yes. He said, are you all right? I said, Jimmy, I am better than I have been in 14 years. That afternoon, I drove into downtown Savannah and sat down with my financial advisor, Reginald Harris. I had been working with Reginald since 2008. He managed the day-to-day operations of Magnolia Holdings out of a small office on Bull Street. He was 46 years old, a graduate of Howard University, the son of a barber and a school teacher. He had more integrity in his left hand than most men on Wall Street have in their entire lives. I told him what I wanted to do. I asked him to prepare for a major capital deployment, up to $3 million of Magnolia Holdings liquid reserves, over the next 60 to 90 days into Charleston commercial real estate. He looked at me over his reading glasses. He said, Mrs. Whitfield, that is aggressive. I said, Reginald, I am 60 years old. I have been conservative for 30 years. I am entitled to one aggressive move. He smiled. He said, yes, ma'am. Let me start preparing the positions. 2 weeks later, Gloria's full report arrived at my door by courier. 347 pages, bound in a dark blue folder. I read every page over the course of 4 days. I took notes. I made charts. I cross-referenced things. Here is what the report told me. Walter Pemberton's financial situation was not just precarious. It was actively collapsing. He had taken out second mortgages on 3 of his 4 hotels during the pandemic, using the hotels as collateral for emergency loans from Charleston Coastal Bank. 2 of those loans were set to balloon in January of 2025, less than 4 months away. The total amount due on the 2 balloon payments was just over $7.2 million. Walter did not have $7.2 million. Walter did not have $2 million. Walter's entire liquid net worth, according to the financial picture Gloria's investigators had assembled, was somewhere around $600,000 in cash and marketable securities. The hotels themselves were struggling. Occupancy was down. The Pemberton Magnolia Inn, the flagship, was at 53% occupancy for the year. Industry standard for a property of that quality was 78%. Staff turnover was high. There were complaints on travel websites going back 2 years about declining service and deferred maintenance. The report also included information about the Pemberton family's personal finances. The estate at Isle of Palms, the house where my son had been married, was heavily mortgaged. Walter had refinanced it in 2022 and pulled out $1.8 million in equity, which he had poured into the hotel business trying to stabilize it. He had lost most of that money. Eleanor's personal wealth, the old money she was always so proud of, turned out to be roughly $200,000 in a trust her grandfather had established in 1962. That was it. The rest was lifestyle. The rest was the appearance of wealth, propped up by Walter's dwindling business. And then there was Spencer. Gloria's investigators had done excellent work on Spencer. He did not, in fact, manage operations for Pemberton Hospitality Group in any meaningful sense. He had an office at the Pemberton Magnolia Inn. He had a title. He had a 6-figure salary. But the actual operations were managed by a general manager named Denise Williamson, a black woman in her late 40s who had been with the company for 11 years and who, according to the interviews Gloria's team had conducted confidentially, was the only reason the company had not collapsed already. Spencer spent most of his time gambling. High-stakes poker in private rooms at a casino in Cherokee, North Carolina, 4 hours from Charleston. Online sports betting. Trips to Las Vegas. Over the previous 18 months, Spencer Pemberton had withdrawn. Through a combination of manipulated expense reports, forged signatures on cash transfers, and one outright theft from a dormant family trust account, a total of $847,600 from Pemberton Hospitality Group and related family entities. His parents did not know. I closed the folder. I sat at my kitchen table. I looked out the window at my garden, at the azaleas my husband had planted 22 years ago, still blooming. I understood completely what I was holding. I was holding the complete and inevitable destruction of the Pemberton family if I chose to use it. Not through cruelty, not through lies, simply through the quiet, methodical application of the truth. I called Gloria back that afternoon. I said, "Gloria, I have read the report. I want to proceed with 3 actions." She said, "I am listening." I said, "First, I want to work with Jimmy Okonkwo to acquire the 2 hotels Walter is going to lose in January, not at a fire sale price, at fair market value, plus a small premium, so there is no argument later that we took advantage. I want clean papers. I want no loose ends." She said, "Okay." I said, "Second, I want to acquire a controlling position in Charleston Coastal Bank. Not all of it, enough to sit on the credit committee. I want to be in the room when decisions are made about the remaining Pemberton loans." She said, "Anna, that is expensive." I said, "Gloria, I have the money. Do it." She said, "Okay." I said, "Third, and this is the most important one. I want to personally acquire the Pemberton Magnolia Inn. Not through Okonkwo Capital, not through any fund, personally, through Magnolia Holdings, and I want to do it before September 15th. She said, "Anna, why September 15th? I said, "Because on September 15th, the Charleston Heritage Society is holding its annual gala at the Pemberton Magnolia Inn. Eleanor Pemberton is on the board. She sends me a Christmas card every year. She has already sent me the invitation this year, 2 weeks before the wedding, because I am technically family now. She does not know I kept the invitation." Gloria was quiet. Then she laughed. Not a happy laugh, a hungry laugh, the laugh of a good lawyer who has just been handed the case of her career. She said, "Anna, you are going to walk into that gala as the owner of the hotel." I said, "Gloria, I am going to walk into that gala as myself, for the first time in my life." The acquisitions took 6 weeks. Jimmy Okonkwo's fund, working through a subsidiary called Southern Gate Hospitality, made a private approach to Walter Pemberton in early October. They offered to buy 2 of his hotels. The Pemberton Magnolia Inn was deliberately not part of the initial offer, at a price that would allow Walter to pay off the January balloon payments with about $300,000 left over. Walter refused the first offer. Pride. I had expected that. 3 weeks later, Charleston Coastal Bank informed Walter that the balloon payments would not be extended and that the bank's new credit policy, adopted by the credit committee in October, did not allow for further accommodations on legacy commercial hospitality loans. I was not in the meeting when that policy was adopted. Gloria sat in the meeting on my behalf. She did not say a word during the discussion. She simply voted, at the end, with the majority. Walter came back to Southern Gate Hospitality 10 days later and accepted the offer at a slightly lower price than originally proposed, because by then Jimmy had let him understand that the market had moved. The 2 hotels closed on November 8th. Walter thought he had saved himself. What Walter did not know was that Southern Gate Hospitality had been created specifically for this transaction, and that its silent majority owner was Magnolia Holdings, LLC. Meanwhile, Gloria and I had been working on the Pemberton Magnolia Inn. The Magnolia Inn was not technically owned by Pemberton Hospitality Group. It was owned by a separate entity, Pemberton Heritage Properties, which had been set up by Walter's father in 1978 as a way to protect the flagship property from the ordinary risks of the hotel business. The trustee of Pemberton Heritage Properties was Walter's elderly aunt, Miss Margaret Pemberton, age 83, who lived alone in a retirement community in Beaufort, South Carolina. I went to see Miss Margaret Pemberton in the last week of October. I drove down to Beaufort. I brought a small bouquet of flowers and a tin of the same lemon cookies my mother used to make. I was wearing a simple gray dress and low heels. Miss Margaret met me in the sunroom of her apartment, a small white-haired lady with bright blue eyes and the sharpest mind of any 83-year-old I have ever encountered. We talked for 3 hours. I told her the truth about everything, about the wedding, about the tray, about my son, about what Walter had been doing with the family hotels, and what Spencer was doing with the family money, and what it all looked like from the outside. I showed her the documentation Gloria had assembled. I did not ask her for anything. At the end of the 3 hours, Miss Margaret took off her reading glasses, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Mrs. Whitfield, my nephew has been an embarrassment to the Pemberton name for 15 years. My grandnephew is a disgrace, and from what you have just told me about my nephew's wife, I have no doubt that she said exactly what you say she said, because she has always been exactly the kind of woman who would." I said, "Miss Margaret, I am not asking you to sell me this hotel. She said, Mrs. Whitfield, I know you are not. That is why I am going to. The Pemberton Magnolia Inn closed on November 22nd. I paid Miss Margaret $4.1 million. She wired $3.8 million of it to a donor-advised fund she set up that same afternoon, naming 3 historically black colleges as the primary beneficiaries. The sale was not public. The paperwork was filed quietly. The hotel's name did not change. The staff did not change. Walter and Eleanor Pemberton did not know that the flagship property of their family's business empire was no longer in their family. The board of the Charleston Heritage Society did not know that the venue they had booked for their September gala was no longer owned by the family they were honoring. Eleanor Pemberton, who walked through the lobby of that hotel 3 times a week, did not know. Nobody knew, except me, and Gloria, and Miss Margaret, and Denise Williamson, the general manager whom I met with privately in early December and to whom I offered a significant raise, a 5-year guaranteed contract, and a small equity stake in the property in exchange for her continued discretion and excellent work. Denise Williamson looked at me across the desk in her office and she said, Mrs. Whitfield, I have been waiting for someone like you to walk in that door for 11 years. The Charleston Heritage Society Gala was held every year on the 3rd Saturday of September. The date was September 20th, 2025, almost exactly 1 year after the wedding. The invitation, still addressed to Anna Whitfield, mother of Darius Whitfield, read, You are cordially invited to join the Charleston Heritage Society for our annual fall gala. Cocktails at 7, dinner at 8. Black tie. I responded yes. I included in my RSVP my official title. Anna Mae Whitfield, Principal Owner, Magnolia Holdings, LLC. I arrived at the Pemberton Magnolia Inn at 7:45 that evening. I was dropped off at the front entrance by a driver because I had decided, that afternoon, that I was not going to park my own car. I was not going to carry my own bag. I was not going to walk up those steps as anyone other than who I actually was. I was wearing a burgundy silk dress, floor length, custom made by a seamstress in Atlanta who had dressed me for 20 years. I was wearing the black Tahitian pearls James had given me on our 25th anniversary, 3 months before he died. I had an emerald pin in my hair, the pin my grandmother had worn to her own wedding in 1937. I was not hiding anything, not anymore. The doorman at the Magnolia Inn was a young black man named Marcus, whom I had met twice in the past 3 months. He opened the door for me and said, Good evening, Mrs. Whitfield. Welcome home. I said, Thank you, Marcus. Denise Williamson was waiting in the lobby. She was wearing a navy blue dress and a small smile. She said, Everything is ready, Mrs. Whitfield. Your table is at the front, and the things we discussed are all in place. I said, Thank you, Denise. I walked into the main ballroom. 300 people. Charleston Society at full attendance. Tuxedos, ball gowns, a string quartet, champagne, exactly the kind of event Eleanor Pemberton lived for. Eleanor was standing near the center of the room, talking to a group of women I vaguely recognized from the wedding. She was wearing a pale pink gown and the same grape-sized pearls. She looked across the room and saw me. Her face did the exact small flinch I had been picturing for 11 months. She excused herself from her conversation. She began walking toward me, with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Walter saw her moving and followed her. Spencer was at the bar, as expected, and did not see me at all at first. Eleanor reached me in the center of the ballroom. She said very loud, very bright, Anna, what a surprise! I did not realize you were attending tonight. Are you here with someone? I said, Mrs. Pemberton, I am here as myself. She laughed, a small, uncertain laugh. She said, Of course you are. I did not see your name on the guest list. I said, I am on the host list. She blinked. Behind me, a voice said, Good evening, Mrs. Pemberton. I see you have met our principal owner. I turned. Denise Williamson had walked up behind me. She was holding 2 glasses of champagne. She handed one to me. She said to Eleanor, Mrs. Pemberton, I believe you have been wanting to speak with ownership about the venue renewal for next year. Mrs. Whitfield and I are happy to discuss that with you later this evening if you have time. Eleanor's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Walter arrived at her elbow. He looked at me. He looked at Denise. He looked at the champagne. He said, What is happening here? Denise smiled at him. She said, Mr. Pemberton, I would like to introduce you to Mrs. Anna Mae Whitfield. She is the principal owner of Magnolia Holdings, which acquired the Pemberton Magnolia Inn in November of last year. She is also, I believe, the mother of your son-in-law. Technically, you are already acquainted." Walter did not move. He did not speak. The color was leaving his face in stages. First the cheeks, then the forehead, then the lips. I said, "Mr. Pemberton, it is good to see you again. 11 months goes by quickly, doesn't it?" He said, You own this hotel?" I said, "Since November 22nd of last year. Your Aunt Margaret is a delightful woman. She sends her love." At that moment, across the room, Darius walked in. He was with Brooke. She was wearing a green dress. She had her hand on his arm. They were laughing about something at the entrance, stopping to greet the Heritage Society president, not yet aware. Then Darius looked up. He saw me. I watched my son's face go through every single stage of recognition in the space of about 4 seconds. Confusion. Shock. The dawning awareness that his mother was standing in the center of the ballroom wearing a burgundy silk gown and black pearls, being deferred to by the general manager of the hotel. The further dawning awareness, coming a half-second later, that his mother-in-law was standing in front of his mother, looking like she had just been slapped. Brooke, beside him, said something. I could not hear her, but I could read her lips. "Babe, is that your—" "What is she wearing?" Darius did not answer her. He walked across the room toward me. Brooke followed, looking confused. Spencer, from the bar, saw his parents' faces and wandered over, bourbon in hand. My son reached me. He stopped about 3 feet away. He said, "Mama?" I said, "Hello, baby." He said, "What? Mama, what is happening?" I said, "What is happening, Darius, is that I am standing in the center of my own hotel, at a party, wearing a dress that your father would have liked. And you are standing here looking at me as if you have never seen me before in your life, which I suppose is true." Eleanor found her voice then. It came out high and thin. She said, "Anna, I do not understand what is happening. Please tell us what is happening." I turned to her. I set my champagne glass down on a nearby table. I looked at her carefully, the way a person looks at a document she is about to sign. I said, "Mrs. Pemberton, last September at my only son's wedding, you handed me a silver tray in front of 200 people and told me to use the back entrance. You told me I was being mistaken for the catering staff. You said this was a private family celebration and that I did not belong in it." Eleanor said, "Anna, that was a misunderstanding. I never meant—" I said, "Mrs. Pemberton, I am not finished." She stopped talking. I said, "For 37 years I lived quietly. I raised my son. I buried my husband. I went to church. I invested the money my husband and I saved together, and I built, very slowly, something that nobody in this room knew existed. I did not hide it because I was ashamed of it. I hid it because my husband taught me that quiet money is the only kind that lasts. And because I believed, until last September, that my son needed to grow up without the weight of his inheritance in order to build his own foundation." I looked at Darius. He was crying. Not loudly, just tears running down his face, his mouth open a little, the way he used to cry when he was a small boy. I looked back at Eleanor. I said, "You taught me I was wrong, not about raising my son, about hiding from people like you. You taught me that a woman who allows herself to be underestimated eventually finds herself handed a serving tray in her own son's house. And I decided that night that I was done being underestimated." I gestured around the ballroom. I said, "Mrs. Pemberton, welcome to my hotel." The room was silent. Not the polite silence of a social gathering. The silence of 300 people realizing all at once that they were watching something they would talk about for the rest of their lives. Eleanor whispered, "Your hotel." I said, "Since November. Your husband's 2 smaller properties are also owned indirectly by my business partners. The bank that holds your remaining mortgages, the one that refused to extend your husband's loans last year, I sit on its credit committee. I have sat on it since October. I voted on the policy that ended your husband's accommodations." Walter made a small sound in his throat. Spencer said too loud, "What the hell is this? Who is this woman?" I turned to Spencer. I had been waiting for this moment. I looked him in the eye. I said, "Spencer, you do not know me, but I know you. I know about Cherokee. I know about the online betting accounts. I know about the expense reports. I know about the dormant trust account your father set up in 2011 that you have been draining since March of last year. $847,600 over 18 months. I have the documentation. Spencer's bourbon glass fell out of his hand. It did not break. It just landed on the carpet and rolled. Eleanor turned slowly to her son. She said, "Spencer, what is she talking about?" Spencer said nothing. Eleanor said again, louder, "Spencer, what is she talking about?" He said, "Mama, she's lying." I said quietly, "Spencer, I am not lying. Your parents deserve to know. I am giving them this information as a gift. What they do with it is their business." I looked back at Eleanor. I said, "Mrs. Pemberton, you asked me a question earlier. You asked me what was happening. I will answer you now." I took one step closer to her, close enough that only she could hear what I said next. But I did not whisper. I spoke in a voice that everyone nearby could hear, and everyone who needed to hear. I said, "Mrs. Pemberton, 1 year ago you handed me a serving tray and told me to use the back entrance. Tonight I am handing you the bill. For everything. And the difference between you and me, Mrs. Pemberton, is that I built this quietly, for 37 years, while you assumed I was the help. I never needed anyone to see it, in order to know I had it. That is the difference between having something and performing it. You have spent your entire life performing. And tonight, the performance ends." I stepped back. I looked at Denise. I said, "Denise, please announce to the guests that dinner is served. And please, as a gesture from ownership, comp every meal tonight. The gala is on the house." Denise said, "Yes, ma'am." I turned to walk out of the ballroom. Darius caught up to me in the hallway. He said, Mama, please, I stopped. I turned to face him. I looked at my son, my only child, the boy I had raised, the man who had looked away in a hallway a year ago. He was crying openly now. He was 33 years old, and he was crying in a hotel hallway at a gala, and his wife was somewhere behind him, probably still in shock. I touched his cheek, once, gently, the way I had touched his cheek when he was 4 years old and scared of a thunderstorm. I said, "Darius, I did not raise you to be rich. I raised you to be right. The day you chose silence over your mother, in front of a room full of strangers who did not know you, you became a person your father would not have recognized. I am not angry at you, baby. I stopped being angry at you a long time ago, but I need you to understand something, and I need you to carry it with you." He was listening. I said, "I will always be your mother. That will never change. But I will not pretend, for you or for anybody else, to be smaller than I am. Not ever again. If you want to know me, you will have to know the whole of me, and you will have to decide on your own whether you can stand next to a woman who will not be made small." He said, "Mama," I said, "when you know, baby, come home. I will be where I have always been." I kissed his forehead. I walked out of the hotel I owned. I got into my car, and I drove home to Savannah. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, there was a knock at my front door. I was in the kitchen, putting up a batch of fig preserves from the tree in my backyard. The radio was on low, tuned to the gospel station. It was a cool day, the first real cool day of the fall. I wiped my hands on my apron. I walked to the front of the house. I opened the door. Darius was standing on my porch. He looked tired. He had lost weight. He was wearing jeans and a plain blue shirt, and he was holding a small wooden box in both hands. He said, "Mama, I filed for divorce 3 weeks ago. I did not take anything. I just left." He opened the box. Inside was his father's wedding ring. The ring I had given him the day he graduated from Yale. The ring James had worn every day of the 26 years we were married. He said, "I forgot who I was, and I forgot who raised me. I am sorry, Mama. I know that is not enough. I know it will take a long time. I just wanted to come home and tell you in person that I remember now." I looked at my son. I thought about the hallway. I thought about the tray. I thought about Eleanor's smile. I thought about Spencer's laugh and Walter's toast and Brooke's hand over her mouth. I thought about 33 years of raising a child alone after his father died, of driving to school plays and football games and graduation ceremonies, of packing lunches and helping with homework, and praying over his bed when he was sick. I thought about James. I thought about what James would say. I stepped back from the door. I opened it wider. I said, "Welcome home, baby. The back door was never for us. Come in the front. He came inside. I closed the door behind him. And that was the beginning of the rest of our lives. If this story touched you, share your own in the comments. Your voice matters. And if there is a mother somewhere in your life who has been made to feel small, call her tonight. Tell her you see her. Because the world does not always, and she has been waiting for someone to notice. Thank you for listening.